Redditor 1. My father didn't share many stories about his time stationed on the military base in New Brunswick. He wasn't the type to tell war stories or brag about his experiences. But when he did open up, the tales were usually fascinating, if not a little mundane. Except for one. One story stuck with me, haunting me long after he shared it. Because it wasn't just strange, it was downright unsettling. It was 1982, and it involved his best friend, a terrifying encounter, and a warning from men in black suits. It started on a quiet evening. My dad's best friend, whom I'll call Mike, and Mike's girlfriend, had plans to go see Tron. This was back when there wasn't much to do on the base, and the nearest movie theater was quite a drive away. They left just after dark, promising to be back late, but with enough time to catch up with my dad before lights out. Less than an hour later, Mike and his girlfriend returned, pulling up in their car much earlier than anyone expected. My dad was outside having a smoke when he saw their vehicle roll into the lot. He noticed right away that something was wrong. The car was a mess, scratched, dented, and covered in streaks of paint in multiple colors. It looked like it had been through a... Mike got out first, his face pale, his movements stiff. His girlfriend followed, and she looked equally shaken. My dad rushed over to meet them, immediately asking, "What happened? Did you get in an accident?" Mike avoided his gaze, brushing him off with a half-hearted excuse about a bad detour. His girlfriend didn't say a word. They both hurried to their quarters, ignoring my dad's questions. The next morning, my dad tried again, cornering Mike in the mess hall. "What happened last night?" he pressed. Mike shook his head. "Just drop it, man," he muttered before walking away. It wasn't like him to be so curt, especially not with my dad. A few days later, Mike finally cracked. My dad found him alone in the barracks, staring at the floor like he was reliving some horrible memory. With a little coaxing, the story spilled out, and my dad wished he hadn't asked. Mike and his girlfriend had been driving along a remote stretch of highway surrounded by nothing but trees and hills. It was the kind of road that felt endless, with no streetlights and only the occasional distant farmhouse. They were halfway to the theater when they rounded a bend and noticed something strange. Ahead of them, over a hill, were lights. Bright, colorful lights. Blue, red, and yellow, flashing in patterns that didn't make sense. They seemed to dance in the sky, moving in ways no aircraft could. Mike slowed the car, squinting at the display, trying to figure out what he was looking at. The lights weren't on the highway, but seemed to hover over a hill in the distance. As they drove closer, they saw a small parking lot at the base of the hill, its entrance marked by an old wooden sign with an arrow pointing toward a hiking trail. Several other cars were already parked there, their occupants standing outside, staring up at the lights. Curiosity got the better of Mike, and he pulled in. "We weren't the only ones there," Mike told my dad. "At least 10 cars were parked, and everyone was looking up at the top of that hill. You could feel it in the air. Something wasn't right." The two of them got out of the car and joined the small crowd. Mike's girlfriend clung to his arm, visibly nervous. The lights were brighter now, pulsating and casting eerie glows against the trees. Some people started murmuring, speculating about what it could be. A few decided to climb the hill to get a better look. That's when it happened. The lights intensified, flooding the entire area with a blinding brilliance. The sound came next, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the ground and into their bones. From behind the hill's peak, a massive disc rose into the sky. It was enormous, easily the size of a football field, and it shimmered with an otherworldly sheen. Lights raced around its edges, and the hum grew louder, more overwhelming. Panic set in. People screamed and ran for their cars. The parking lot descended into chaos as drivers tried to flee, their vehicles scraping and colliding in their desperation to escape. Mirrors snapped off, paint was scratched, and bumpers crumpled as car after car squeezed through the narrow exit. Mike and his girlfriend barely managed to squeeze out, their car taking several hits as they swerved back onto the highway. "We didn't look back," Mike said. "We just drove, fast. I don't even remember the drive back to base. It's like my brain just shut off until we got here." The next day, Mike took my dad to the parking lot where it had happened. Sure enough, the place was littered with car parts. Side mirrors, hubcaps, pieces of broken headlights. There were deep gouges in the gravel where vehicles had spun out in their haste. but there was no sign of the lights, the hum, or the disc. It was as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. That wasn't the end of it. A few days later, two men in black suits showed up on base. They moved with purpose, their presence casting a chill over everyone they encountered. They went straight to Mike, pulling him aside for a private conversation. When they were done, they sent him on his way with a stern warning. "They may told me to shut up about it," Mike told my dad, his voice low. "Said if I wanted to keep my career, I'd forget what I saw and never speak of it again." My dad was horrified. "What do you think they were? The lights? The disc? What was it?" Mike shook his head. "I don't know, and I don't want to know." For years, my dad kept that story to himself, unsure what to make of it. He didn't believe in UFOs, but he also couldn't deny the fear in Mike's voice or the damage to his car. He didn't know what the men in black suits were protecting or hiding, but he knew one thing: whatever happened on that hill was real, and it wasn't something the world was ready to understand. Redditor 2. The story my grandfather told me about an unforgettable winter night in a remote village of northern Iraq has lingered in my mind since I was a child. He wasn't the kind of man to tell tall tales. His words carried the weight of experience and honesty. What makes this story even more compelling is that other elders in the village corroborated it, all swearing by its truth. It takes place sometime between 1935 and 1945, in a time and place where technology and modernity were distant dreams and life was simple yet harsh, especially during the unforgiving winters. In those days, winter in northern Iraq was a time of rest. With the fields frozen over and the snow blanketing the mountainous terrain, there was little to do but stay indoors, live off summer's harvest, and celebrate. Winter weddings were common, and it was at one such wedding that the bizarre events unfolded. The night was cold, and the village's reception building was alive with warmth and laughter. My grandfather was among the guests, enjoying the feast and music as the singer entertained everyone with his rich voice and spirited tunes. But as the evening went on, the singer excused himself to step outside and didn't return. At first, no one thought much of it. After all, relieving oneself back then required a trek into the wilderness, a hole dug in the snow, and a bit of privacy. But an hour passed, and then another. The singer's absence began to stir concern. Guests whispered among themselves, some worried he might have slipped on the icy ground or wandered too far in the dark. My grandfather, always a practical man, decided to look for him. He ventured out into the bitter cold, his breath visible in the moonlight. The ground was untouched, the pristine snow reflecting a silvery glow. My grandfather followed the singer's tracks, expecting to find him somewhere nearby. The tracks led a fair distance from the building, then stopped abruptly. No footprints led back, no evidence of the singer having found a spot and returned. The area was eerily still, and the tracks simply vanished, as if the singer had been plucked from the earth. Puzzled and uneasy, my grandfather returned to the wedding, where the guests were growing increasingly agitated. Some suggested organizing a search party, while others speculated he might have taken ill or wandered off in a drunken stupor. Just as the tension reached its peak, the door to the reception hall creaked open. The singer stepped inside. He was pale, his face drawn, and his movements slow. Relief washed over the crowd, followed quickly by curiosity and a flurry of questions. The groom was particularly irate, berating him for disappearing for so long. But the singer wasn't angry or defensive. Instead, he seemed distracted, his eyes distant. He stammered an apology and took a seat, visibly shaken. It took some coaxing, but eventually the singer began to explain what had happened. He spoke haltingly, his words punctuated by long pauses, as if he were struggling to process the memory himself. "I had just stepped out to relieve myself," he said. "I was walking to find a spot when two figures appeared behind me. I didn't hear them approach. They were just there." The room fell silent as the guests leaned in to hear. The singer described the figures as humanoid, but not quite human. They wore strange, smooth clothing that shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and their faces were partially obscured by what he could only describe as a glow. They weren't threatening, he said, but there was something unsettling about their presence. "They mate asked me, 'Do you want to go somewhere far?'" the singer continued. "I didn't understand what they meant, so I asked them, 'What do you mean by far?' They replied, 'How about China?' The crowd murmured in confusion. "China? Why China?" Isadom led me to a floating vehicle, the singer said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It was hovering just above the ground, unlike anything I've ever seen. They took me by the arm and guided me inside. He described the interior as impossibly bright and clean with no discernible edges or corners. He couldn't recall the journey in detail, only that they flew very fast and very high. Within moments, or so it felt, they arrived. I don't know how to explain it, the singer said, but they brought me to a place that I can only describe as China. There were people, buildings, and a vast, beautiful garden filled with flowers I had never seen before. It was warm and the air smelled sweet. The singer claimed he wandered the garden for a while, marveling at the strange and vibrant flora. He even picked a small bouquet of flowers to take back with him. Eventually, he told the figures he was ready to return, and they obliged. The journey back was as disorienting as the trip there, and before he knew it, he was standing outside the reception hall once more. The guests were incredulous. Some laughed, dismissing his story as the ramblings of a drunk or a dreamer. Others were less certain, unsettled by the singer's demeanor and the detail of his account. But then he produced the flowers. A hush fell over the room as he held up the small bouquet. The flowers were vibrant and fresh, their colors vivid against the drab winter backdrop. My grandfather later described them as nothing he had ever seen before. Delicate petals of deep blues, fiery reds, and golden yellows. They looked out of place, otherworldly. The most baffling part was that such flowers couldn't possibly have come from the snowy mountains of northern Iraq in the dead of winter. There were no greenhouses, no imports from faraway lands. The flowers were real, tangible proof that the singer's story wasn't just the product of an overactive imagination. For the rest of the evening, the singer kept the flowers close, refusing to let anyone take them. The mood at the wedding shifted. Laughter gave way to unease, and the night ended earlier than expected. Years later, when my grandfather recounted the story to me, he still spoke of the flowers with wonder. They were real, he said firmly. We all saw them, we all touched them. The singer's story became a local legend, whispered about in hushed tones during long winters by the fire. No one could explain what had happened that night, and the singer himself rarely spoke of it again. He continued to live in the village, a quiet man who never sought attention or fame. To this day, I don't know what to make of the story. My grandfather wasn't one for embellishments, and neither were the other elders who corroborated it. Whether it was an encounter with beings from another world or something else entirely, the tale of the singer, the strange figures, and the flowers from a faraway land remains one of the most intriguing and inexplicable stories I've ever heard. Redditor 3. It was Thanksgiving break during my undergrad years, and I had accepted an invitation from one of my astronomy-loving friends to visit his family in a remote part of eastern Iowa. His family home was nestled far away from city lights, where the night sky stretched endlessly, revealing a tapestry of stars untainted by light pollution. It was the perfect retreat for a few days of stargazing, camaraderie, and most importantly, endless plates of Thanksgiving food. On our second night there, we decided to head out into one of the sprawling fields near his home. The grass was tall, reaching just above our knees, and the chill of late November hung in the air. Armed with blankets, a thermos of hot chocolate, and our curiosity, the three of us, my friend, another astronomy enthusiast, and I, planted ourselves in the middle of the field and gazed up at the stars. The sky was alive that night. Shooting stars streaked across the heavens every few minutes, drawing gasps of awe from us. My friend, the astronomy buff, pointed out constellations, named stars, and occasionally mentioned celestial phenomena I couldn't hope to remember. It felt peaceful, almost sacred, to be under such a vast sky. As we lay there, my friend suddenly pointed upward, his voice sharp with curiosity. "What is that?" We followed his finger to a bright light, stationary yet somehow alive with movement. It was too high to be a drone and too low to be a satellite. Unlike a star, it bobbed slightly in the sky as though suspended on an invisible string. It wasn't moving linearly like a plane or satellite might. Instead, it darted slightly to the left, then up, then down, almost like it was alive. "It's probably just a planet," I suggested, though my tone betrayed my uncertainty. "No way," my astronomy-savvy friend replied, his voice laced with conviction. "There shouldn't be any visible planets tonight. and planets don't move like that. We watched the object for a few minutes, transfixed. It shimmered faintly, its light flickering like a dying candle. Then, just as abruptly as it appeared, the light fizzled out. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, as though it had been swallowed by the sky itself. We sat in silence for a moment, exchanging wide-eyed glances. "Well," my other friend said with a nervous chuckle, "guess we can officially say we saw a UFO." We laughed, the tension dissipating as quickly as it had arrived. We were still buzzing with excitement when we decided to pack up and head back to the house. That's when we saw him. About 50 yards ahead, in the middle of the field, a lone figure sat hunched over. He was young, our age, maybe a little older, and completely out of place. He wasn't wearing a jacket or even a shirt, just a pair of jeans that looked woefully insufficient for the November chill. He was sitting on the cold ground, arms wrapped tightly around his knees, shivering uncontrollably. We froze. None of us had seen him approach, and the field was wide open. If he had walked in, we would have noticed him. My heart raced as a dozen scenarios flashed through my mind. Was he lost, injured, or something worse? "Hey," my friend called out, his voice hesitant. "Are you okay?" The figure lifted his head slowly, his face pale and blank. He stared at us for a long moment before answering, his voice faint. "I'm fine." He didn't look fine. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were glassy, his movements sluggish. But there was something else, something unsettling about the way he spoke, as though he wasn't fully present. "Where's your shirt?" I asked, keeping my distance. "It's freezing out here." He didn't answer, just tightened his grip around his knees and shivered harder. After a moment, he muttered, "I need to go to the hospital." That snapped us into action. My friend pulled out his phone and called 911 while the rest of us tried to coax the man to his feet. He resisted at first, mumbling incoherently, but eventually we managed to get him moving. My friend offered him his jacket, draping it over his shoulders as we guided him toward the nearest road. The paramedics and police arrived about 10 minutes later, meeting us at a small gas station on the edge of town. The man didn't resist as they loaded him into the ambulance. He sat quietly, staring straight ahead, answering their questions in clipped, disjointed sentences. The police asked us a few questions too. How had we found him? Did we know who he was? Had we noticed anything unusual? We told them everything, including the strange light in the sky. One of the officers exchanged a look with his partner but didn't say anything. As the ambulance pulled away, the man turned his head and looked at us. For the first time, his expression changed. There was a flicker of something, gratitude, maybe, or recognition. "Thanks," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough for us to hear. We watched the ambulance disappear down the road, the night swallowing its red and blue lights. None of us spoke on the walk back to my friend's house. The field, the light, the strange man, it all felt too surreal to process. The next morning, over a breakfast of pancakes and bacon, we told my friend's family what had happened. His parents listened intently, their faces shifting between concern and disbelief. Maybe he was just a drifter, his dad suggested, or someone who got lost out there. My friend said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Probably." But as we cleaned up after breakfast, he pulled me aside. "You don't think it was, he trailed off, glancing out the window toward the field. I shrugged, unsure of what to say. "I don't know, man. It's weird, but who knows?" We didn't talk about it again for the rest of the trip. The holiday carried on, filled with laughter, food, and warmth. By the time we left, the events of that night felt like a distant memory, buried under the haze of pumpkin pie and turkey leftovers. Still, every now and then I find myself thinking about that man. How had he ended up in the middle of that field, barefoot and shirtless on a freezing November night? Why hadn't we seen him before he appeared? And why did he seem so detached, as though he wasn't entirely there? I don't have answers, just questions that linger like the faintest stars in the night sky. All I know is that something strange happened in that field, something I'll never fully understand. Redditor 4. For as long as I could remember, I'd been plagued by vivid nightmares about aliens. The Greys, to be specific. They weren't the friendly visitor from another galaxy kind. These were creatures of pure dread, emotionless and invasive. Their cold, oversized eyes would stare into me, not at me, and I'd feel something worse than fear. It was as if they were peeling back layers of my mind, one by one, probing thoughts I didn't even know existed. In these dreams, I would often find myself in ordinary situations, watching TV, walking in a park, or reading in my room, when a creeping sensation would crawl over me. The air would grow heavy, and a distinct hum, almost like white noise, would fill the space around me. Then the Greys would appear, always out of nowhere, their elongated bodies seemingly slipping through the fabric of reality itself. Every time, the same sequence of events would unfold. First, they would hover silently, just watching me. I'd feel that indescribable horror take over, a primal panic that made it impossible to move. My limbs would become sluggish, like wading through wet cement. I'd try to scream, but no sound would come out. My vision would blur, my ears would ring, and eventually, I'd collapse into darkness. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the shadows in my room suddenly full of menace. Sometimes I could still feel their presence, as though the dream hadn't fully ended. It wasn't like waking up from a typical nightmare where relief washes over you as soon as you realize it was just a dream. This was different. The fear lingered, clinging to me for hours, and every time I thought about it, an icy shiver would ripple down my spine. At first, these nightmares were sporadic, maybe once every few months, but then they became more frequent, especially when I traveled or went on vacation. It was as though the change in surroundings triggered something. It got to the point where I dreaded going to bed, afraid of what might come next. I'd sit up late, scrolling through my phone or binge-watching shows, trying to exhaust myself to the point of dreamless sleep. It rarely worked. One night, after weeks of restless nights and mounting frustration, I decided enough was enough. I was tired of waking up in terror, of feeling like a prisoner in my own mind. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I made a conscious decision. If the Greys came again, I wouldn't run. I would face them. Sure enough, they came. The dream began innocuously, as it always did. I was sitting in a park, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. But then, the hum started, low and steady, building in intensity. The sunlight dimmed, and the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. I turned, and there they were, a group of 3 standing motionless a few yards away. The fear hit me like a wave, but I clenched my fists and stayed put. Not this time, I thought. The Greys began to move closer, their long, spindly arms reaching out. I could feel them probing my mind again, their presence invasive and overwhelming. My vision started to blur, and I felt the familiar dizziness creeping in. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I held my ground. Then, something unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, a sword appeared in my hand. A gleaming, silvery blade that felt impossibly real. It wasn't something I conjured consciously. It was just there, as though my mind had created it as a last-ditch defense. Without hesitation, I swung the blade, slicing through the closest Grey. It dissolved instantly, disintegrating into a fine, silvery mist. The other 2 hesitated, their movements no longer smooth and calculated. For the first time, they seemed uncertain, even afraid. I didn't give them a chance to recover. I charged, cutting through one and then the other, their forms dissipating like smoke in the wind. When the last one was gone, the hum stopped and the dream shifted. The park was no longer dark and oppressive. The sunlight returned, warm and inviting, and the air felt lighter. For the first time in years, I woke up without the weight of fear pressing down on me. That was 3 years ago, and I haven't had a single nightmare about the Greys since. It was as if defeating them in that dream broke some kind of hold they had over me. I can't fully explain it. Maybe it was just my subconscious finally confronting a deep-seated fear. Or maybe, just maybe, they were real, and I destroyed their connection to me. I've thought about it a lot since then. I'm still skeptical about alien abductions and all the stories you hear. I'm not saying they're all fake. Who am I to discount someone else's experience? But I think a lot of them might be tied to overactive imaginations, sleep paralysis, or something else our brains do that we don't fully understand. What I experienced might have been nothing more than a vivid dream, my mind creating a physical weapon to fight off an intangible fear. But there's a part of me that wonders, what if they were real? What if, in that dream, I truly destroyed some kind of dream avatar or mental projection they were using to access me. It's a question I'll probably never have an answer to, but one thing is certain. I'm glad they're gone. For now, my nights are my own again. Redditor 5. It was a bone-chilling winter night, the kind where the silence outside feels almost unnatural, the kind where every noise, no matter how faint, seems amplified, echoing through the stillness. I had been up late, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, unable to sleep. At about 4 a.m., a sharp thirst pulled me out of bed, and I trudged down to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I stood at the sink, the glass pressed against my lips. I heard it, a low-pitched buzzing sound, faint but persistent, vibrating through the walls. At first I thought it might be the heating system acting up, but as I strained to listen, I realized it was coming from outside. Curiosity and unease mingled in my chest as I set the glass down and moved toward the back door. The buzzing grew louder as I stepped into the backyard, the frosty air biting against my skin. I looked up, and there it was. About 600 feet above me hovered a rounded, impossibly bright object. Its light wasn't harsh like a floodlight, but it bathed everything in a surreal glow, illuminating the backyard in a way that felt utterly unnatural. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My first thought was that it was some kind of drone, but the sheer size of it and the silence apart from that steady hum made that impossible. The longer I stared, the less control I felt over my own body. A strange sensation washed over me, like invisible threads were holding me in place. I wasn't scared, exactly, but I wasn't calm either. It was as though my emotions had been dulled, muted by whatever force surrounded me. I stood there, unable to move, my eyes locked on the glowing object. It hovered for what felt like an eternity, though it could have been mere seconds. Then, without warning, it began to ascend. Slowly at first, then faster, much faster, until it shot into the sky at an angle, disappearing into the thick clouds above. The buzzing sound faded with it, leaving behind an almost oppressive silence. I stood there for a moment longer, my mind racing to process what I had just seen. Had I really witnessed a UFO? Was it even possible? My feet eventually obeyed me, and I stumbled back inside, locking the door behind me as if that could somehow protect me from whatever had been out there. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a weather balloon, a freak optical illusion, something with a rational explanation. But the way my hands shook as I climbed back into bed betrayed my own disbelief. That's when the dream, or what I thought was a dream. In the dream, I was no longer in my bed. I was lying on a smooth, cold surface, surrounded by a faint, pulsing light. My body felt weightless, almost like I was floating, but I couldn't move. Figures moved around me, humanoid but distinctly not human. They were tall and slender, their skin a pale, translucent gray. Their eyes were large and dark, void-like, as though they could see straight through me, into the deepest corners of my mind. They didn't speak, at least not with words, but I could feel their thoughts, impressions of curiosity and detachment pressing against my consciousness. One of them extended a long, spindly arm toward me, and I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my right forearm, as if something was being inserted or removed. I wanted to scream, to fight, but I couldn't. My body wasn't mine to control. The figures moved around me with precision, their movements almost mechanical. The room itself felt alive, its walls humming with a faint energy that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it ended. I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, the faint outline of morning light creeping through the blinds. My heart pounded as I sat up, clutching my arm where I had felt the pain in the dream. To my shock, there was a small, circular mark there, reddened and tender, like a fresh injection site. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe I'd scratched myself in my sleep, or it was a mark from leaning against something earlier. But the more I thought about the dream, the more vivid it became. It didn't fade like dreams usually do. Instead, it lingered, every detail etched into my memory, as though it had really happened. For days, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the questions gnawed at me. What if the dream wasn't just a dream? What if the UFO had done something to me? made me think it was all in my imagination. The idea seemed absurd, yet I couldn't shake it. Even now, I don't have answers. I never saw the UFO again, and the mark on my arm faded after a week, but the memory remains, as vivid as the night it happened. I don't tell many people about it. Most would probably laugh it off, call it a hallucination or an overactive imagination. Maybe they're right, but deep down, I know what I saw, and whatever it was real. Redditor 6. It was a warm summer evening in the mid-90s when my family decided to escape the usual routine and rent a secluded cottage on the Turkish coast. The place was a picturesque haven, perched near the sea with a panoramic view of the horizon. It was far enough from any bustling town to feel like we were alone in the world, a sanctuary for peace and quiet. The cottage itself was modest, a single-story home with whitewashed walls and a red-tiled roof, surrounded by tall, swaying grasses and the occasional cluster of olive trees. Nights there were particularly serene. The gentle crashing of waves against the rocks and the occasional rustle of a night breeze through the trees were the only sounds that accompanied us. That night, however, was anything but peaceful. We had just finished dinner, the remnants of grilled fish and fresh bread still lingering on the table. The family gathered in the small living room, chatting, laughing, and sipping on Turkish tea. Outside, the dogs, two scruffy mutts my grandmother had adopted for the trip, lounged lazily in the cool evening air. It all started with the dogs. At first, it was just a low growl, almost imperceptible against the backdrop of the night. Then came the barking. Vicious, frantic barking. The kind of barking that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Everyone fell silent, the air in the room thickening with unease. My grandmother's brother, Uncle Ivan, was the first to act. A retired schoolteacher with a calm demeanor, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, muttering something about foxes or stray cats. The rest of us followed, hesitant but curious, peering out into the dark expanse. The barking grew louder, the dogs now darting back and forth, their fur standing on end. Uncle Ivan scanned the area with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a distant glow in the sky, faint but unmistakable, a light that didn't belong to the stars or the moon. "What is that?" Uncle Ivan muttered, his voice tight with a mix of confusion and dread. The rest of us followed his gaze, craning our necks to see. The light grew brighter, larger as it approached. It wasn't just one light, it was three, arranged in a perfect triangular pattern. The object itself was massive, its edges barely discernible against the dark sky, but the triangle shape was clear. It moved silently, gliding toward us with an eerie grace that defied explanation. By now, everyone was outside, staring up in stunned silence. My younger cousin clung to my aunt's leg, her small hands trembling. My grandmother crossed herself repeatedly, whispering prayers under her breath. Uncle Ivan, ever the rational one, tried to make sense of it. "Some sort of military aircraft," he said, though his voice wavered with doubt. As it drew nearer, the object began to descend. The lights illuminated the ground around the cottage, bathing everything in a surreal, otherworldly glow. The dogs' barking reached a fever pitch, their frantic movements kicking up dust and leaves. Then, the cottage itself began to tremble. At first it was subtle, a faint vibration underfoot, but it quickly escalated. The walls shook, rattling the windows and causing dishes in the kitchen to clatter and crash. A picture frame fell from the wall, the glass shattering on the floor. My aunt screamed, grabbing my cousin and rushing back inside. The rest of us followed, hearts pounding, as the vibrations grew more intense. Inside the cottage, the noise was deafening. It wasn't just the sound of shaking walls. There was a low-frequency hum, almost like the sound of an enormous engine revving up. It was a sound you could feel in your bones, a deep, resonant vibration that made your chest tighten. We huddled together in the living room, staring out the window at the glowing object. It hovered just above the ground now, close enough that we could make out its surface, smooth, metallic, and almost seamless. It was like nothing we had ever seen before, nothing we could even begin to comprehend. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to ascend. Slowly at first, then with a speed that seemed impossible. Within seconds, it was gone, a mere speck in the sky before disappearing entirely. The dogs fell silent, the vibrations ceased, and the cottage was plunged into an almost deafening quiet. For a long moment, no one spoke. We just sat there, staring at each other, our faces pale and drawn. Uncle Ivan was the first to break the silence. Did everyone see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded. There was no denying it. Whatever it was, we had all seen it. The rest of the night passed in a haze. No one slept. The next morning, we ventured outside to survey the damage. The yard was littered with fallen branches, and the dog seemed shaken but unharmed. There was no sign of the object, no evidence that it had ever been there. For years after, the story became a sort of taboo in our family. No one liked to talk about it, and when it did come up, it was always with a sense of unease. My grandparents, who were deeply religious, saw it as some sort of divine warning. Uncle Ivan maintained that it was probably a military experiment, though even he couldn't explain the lack of noise or the intense vibrations. As for me, I still don't know what to make of it. I've tried to rationalize it over the years, to find a logical explanation that fits, but no matter how I frame it, the memory of that night refuses to fade. I can still see the lights, still feel the tremors, still hear the dogs barking as if they knew something we didn't. Whatever it was, it left a mark on all of us. And even now, decades later, I can't look up at the night sky without wondering what's out there. Watch Redditor 7. The night I had the worst nightmare of my life remains etched in my memory like a scar that refuses to fade. I was 8 years old, and for all the simplicity of childhood, that night was anything but simple. It began in my bed, wrapped in the familiar comfort of my blanket, the dim glow of my bedside lamp casting faint shadows on the wall. I had mastered the art of pretending to be asleep, a survival tactic for avoiding CCD classes, escaping reprimands, or just being carried to bed from the car when I was too tired to walk. That night, however, my pretense turned into something far more sinister. I remember lying there, my breathing slow and deliberate, when a dark figure climbed through my bedroom window. The figure didn't use the typical creeping motions you'd expect from an intruder. It moved with a purpose, smooth and silent, almost floating. I instinctively kept my eyes closed, my mind convinced that this was just another dream, albeit more vivid than usual. As the figure approached, I felt my body being lifted, an eerie sensation of weightlessness enveloping me. It wasn't like being carried by a person. There was no sense of hands or grip, just an overwhelming sense of ascension. My stomach turned as though I were on a carnival ride, and my heart raced against my will. I didn't dare open my eyes. If this was a dream, I wanted to wake up. If it wasn't, I didn't want to know what was waiting for me. I felt the sensation of stopping, like an elevator coming to a halt. Hesitantly, I opened my eyes. What I saw was nothing I could comprehend. I was in a dark room, lit with a reddish hue that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The space felt both vast and confining, a contradiction that made my head spin. The air smelled metallic, though I couldn't see any aventive source. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. Then came the pinch. It was sharp, precise. A soft jab on the back of my left hand and then again on the front of my right palm. I winced but didn't scream, my voice caught in my throat. The pain wasn't unbearable, but it was precise, deliberate. It was as if someone or something was collecting data from me, cataloging me for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I woke up in my bed, my heart pounding like a drum. The familiar walls of my room surrounded me, but they offered no comfort. Tears streamed down my face as I bolted downstairs to find my babysitter. She was in the kitchen, half asleep herself, and I collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She did her best to soothe me, assuring me it was just a bad dream. At the time, I believed her. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized something wasn't right. As I brushed my teeth, I noticed a faint scar on the back of my left hand. It wasn't large, but it was there. A perfect, tiny incision that hadn't been there before. I examined it closely, running my fingers over the area, trying to rationalize its presence. Then I felt something strange in my right palm. Beneath the skin was a hard, spherical object, no larger than a small ball bearing. My heart skipped a beat. I showed my parents, but they dismissed it. Probably a cyst, my mom said, offering little concern. Happens to kids all the time. But it didn't feel like a cyst. It was too solid, too deliberate. Over the years, the metal object became a source of both fascination and frustration. It caused the skin around it to bubble and swell, creating warts that seemed to sprout overnight. Metal detectors at airports and shopping malls would inexplicably go off when I passed through, much to my embarrassment. Doctors were equally baffled. They performed x-rays, but none could explain what the object was or how it got there. Probably just a calcification, one said, though he didn't sound convinced. Over time, I began to notice patterns. The object became more irritable in certain places, churches for one, and anywhere near a high concentration of electricity, like airports or near circuit breakers. For years, I avoided having it removed. The thought of being anesthetized terrified me, and on some level, I had grown attached to it. It was a part of me, a silent reminder of that strange night. Then, 5 years later, it fell out on its own. I was washing my hands when I felt it shift. A small hole opened in the skin, and the metal sphere tumbled out into the sink. I stared at it in shock, turning it over in my fingers. It was perfectly smooth, save for a tiny indentation running around its equator, and dotted with what looked like microscopic craters, like a golf ball. I didn't know what to do. In my panic, I dropped it and it spiraled down the drain before I could stop it. I spent the next hour disassembling the pipes beneath the sink, hoping to retrieve it, but it was gone. All that remained was a small, grayish patch of skin on my palm where it had been. Even now, I still have the scar on my left hand. It's smaller than it was back then, but it's there, a constant reminder of something I can't fully explain. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened. Was it just a nightmare that spiraled into something more? Was the metal object a bizarre coincidence, an unrelated medical anomaly? Or was it something else, something otherworldly? I don't know if I'll ever have an answer, but I've made peace with the mystery. Whether it was a dream, a medical oddity, or something beyond human comprehension, it shaped me. It taught me that the world, and perhaps the universe, is far stranger than we can imagine. And while I may never know the truth, the scars on my hand and in my memory will always tell the story. Redditor 8. I was 12 years old when it happened for the first time. It was 1987, and I say abducted, but that's not really the right word. You don't fight it. You don't scream or struggle. There's a strange calm about the whole thing, a feeling like someone wrapping you in a warm, heavy blanket and guiding you somewhere you know you shouldn't go, but you can't help but follow. It's only later, much later, when the memories filter back in, that you feel violated, unsettled, like a trespasser walk through the most sacred corners of your mind. The first thing I remember is the light soft, but everywhere, coming from no discernible source. The walls around me seemed alive, shimmering faintly like ripples across water. I wasn't restrained. I stood on my own, but the air felt thick, almost magnetic, making movement sluggish. That's when they entered. Small figures, no taller than a child, their beige skin smooth and featureless like polished clay. Their heads were oversized, their limbs long and delicate, their large black eyes impossible to read. The small ones, the drones as I came to call them, didn't speak. They didn't need to. When they wanted me to follow, I followed. When they wanted me still, I froze. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was as though they exuded authority, like they were the natural order of things, and I was merely a piece within it. The walls of the room, which seemed to hum faintly, were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They weren't metal, wood, or plastic. They were translucent yet opaque, shifting in ways that made my head ache if I stared too long. They brought me to another part of the room, a darker corner where the air felt colder. Without words, they began their work. They didn't use machines like you'd see in hospitals or labs. The walls themselves seemed to scan, probe, and record. Sometimes I'd feel a quick, sharp pinch, a tissue sample taken from my lower back, or a sensation like being poked with a small needle in the fleshy part of my thigh. It wasn't overly painful, but there was no gentleness about it either. They didn't numb the area, didn't offer explanations, they just did it. I would see others there too sometimes. Humans like me. We rarely made eye contact, and no one spoke. Once, a man caught my eye briefly. He looked terrified, his eyes darting around the room. The drones led him behind a translucent wall, and I never saw him again. Over time, I got to know two of them, or at least, they became more familiar to me. They asked me to call them Jack and Jenna, though I'm sure those weren't their names. I couldn't tell if they were male or female. Honestly, I wasn't even sure they had genders. They had a presence, though, a kind of wisdom that felt ancient, as if they'd been watching humanity for thousands of years. Jack was more direct, asking questions about my life, my emotions, my reactions to various images and scenarios they showed me on walls that acted like screens. Jenna, on the other hand, seemed softer, more curious about abstract things like art and music. They were fascinated by our culture. Jack once asked me about bluegrass music, and when I hesitated, he showed me a holographic image of a banjo. Explain the appeal, he had said, or thought, or somehow communicated. Their interest wasn't just academic. It felt like genuine curiosity, like they were trying to understand what made us tick. But they had their limits. Questions about their own origins were strictly off-limits. The few times I asked, Jack's demeanor would shift abruptly, his large eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "You do not need to know," he said once. And that was the end of it. From what I gathered, they had been visiting Earth for tens of thousands of years. They showed me fragments of human history, scenes of Neanderthals huddled around fires, ancient Egyptians erecting the pyramids, medieval peasants working in fields. It was like a highlight reel of human civilization, yet always, in the periphery, there were glimpses of them, silent observers blending into the background, unnoticed by the people they were watching. "Why do you care about us?" I asked once. Jack tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "You are significant," he finally said, "in ways you do not yet understand." Their motives remained a mystery. They didn't need our resources, they said. They didn't need water, oxygen, or food. They didn't want to colonize or invade. "We don't have anything you want," I'd said once, and Jack had replied, "Correct." That left me wondering, if we had nothing to offer, why were they here? They explained that their home was both impossibly far and inexplicably close, a concept that made my head spin. "Home is too far for you to understand," Jenna had said, "but also close to the side," whatever that meant. Between 1987 and 2021, they took me dozens of times. Sometimes it was every year, other times there were long gaps. Between 1995 and 2000, for instance, they didn't take me at all. Each time they kept me for what felt like hours, though the longest visit stretched into weeks. During that time, they had me maintain my human routine, making phone calls, pretending everything was normal. It was surreal, like living in two worlds at once. Their technology was beyond anything I could comprehend. Once, Jack showed me a room that appeared to stretch infinitely, filled with shimmering, translucent shapes that pulsed and shifted as if alive. "What is this?" I asked, but he simply shook his head. "It is not for you." In July 2021, they said everything would change. "That is when we will come openly," Jenna told me during one of my last visits. "The program will evolve." When I asked what that meant, she only said, "You will see." Their visits stopped after that. I haven't seen them since, and part of me wonders if I ever will again. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself looking up at the sky, half expecting to see a faint shimmer of light or hear the familiar hum that signaled their arrival. I don't know why they chose me. I don't know what they wanted or what their ultimate goal is. But I do know this. They're out there, watching, waiting. And if July 2021 was meant to be the beginning of something new, then perhaps we're already living in their world, whether we realize it or not. Redditor 9. It was a clear, quiet August night 2 years ago, one of those evenings where the world feels wide open and endless. Living in northern Massachusetts along the Atlantic meant that light pollution was minimal, and the night sky often stretched like an infinite canvas above me. On particularly good nights like this one, you could see stars faint enough to make you marvel at their persistence against the dark. I had my old dog with me that evening, a loyal companion who had been by my side through more years than I cared to count. Bless his soul, he moved a little slower those days, but the rhythm of our walks had become our shared ritual, a time to reflect and connect in the stillness. We had paused by a familiar stretch of road where the trees gave way to an open view of the sky. I lit a cigarette, savoring the quiet moment, the only sounds the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the ocean. It was as I exhaled a cloud of smoke that my gaze shifted upward. And there, in the vast expanse of the heavens, I saw them. At first, I thought they were satellites. I've spent many nights stargazing and have come to recognize the telltale signs of satellites and space debris, small, faint points of light, moving in steady, linear paths across the sky. But these were different. There were two of them, faint but discernible against the backdrop of stars. They moved not in the predictable arcs of satellites, but in a dance that defied logic. They weaved toward each other and then away again, almost as if they were engaged in some cosmic game of tag. Their motions were fluid, almost playful, yet deliberate in a way that suggested purpose. I stood frozen, cigarette forgotten between my fingers, watching as they stopped and hovered, suspended as if they were considering their next move. Then, they resumed their motion, tracing a pattern in the sky that seemed impossibly graceful. It was mesmerizing. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring upward, captivated by the silent performance unfolding above me. Time seemed irrelevant, my thoughts entirely consumed by those tiny, distant lights. Then, without warning, something shifted, not in the sky, but within me. It wasn't fear, far from it. It was a profound sense of connection, a sudden, overwhelming awareness that these lights, whatever they were, represented something far greater than myself, greater than this world I called home. It was as though they carried with them an unspoken message, a reminder that we are not alone in the universe, that there are others out there, beings or forces, experiencing their own journeys through happiness and suffering just as we do. A warmth spread through me, a joy so pure and unexpected that it brought tears to my eyes. I felt seen, not in the invasive way of being watched, but in a way that acknowledged my existence as part of something infinitely larger. In that moment, the boundaries between me and the vastness of the cosmos seemed to blur, leaving only a sense of unity. What happened next, I can't recall. The memory grows hazy after that point, as though my mind, overwhelmed by the enormity of the experience, chose to let the details slip away. I must have finished my cigarette, whistled for my dog, and returned home, but the specifics elude me. What remains is the feeling, that indescribable mix of awe, joy, and connection that I've told only a handful of people about that night, and even then only in vague terms. It's not that I'm ashamed or worried about being judged. It's more that the experience feels deeply personal, almost sacred. How do you explain to someone that you felt the presence of something or someone out there, and that instead of fear, it filled you with love? Even now, 2 years later, I think about those lights often. I wonder what they were, why they moved as they did, and why I happened to look up at that exact moment. Was it mere coincidence or was it something more? I don't have the answers, and maybe I never will, but that doesn't matter to me. What matters is the connection I felt that night, the reminder that the universe is vast and mysterious, filled with possibilities we can't yet comprehend. It's a story I carry with me, not as proof of anything, but as a quiet testament to the beauty and wonder that still exists, waiting to be noticed. And every now and then, when the night is clear and the stars are out, I'll pause during my evening walk, look up at the sky, and hope for another glimpse of those distant dancing lights. Because even if they never return, the memory of that night has left its mark, a reminder that sometimes the universe speaks to us in ways we may never fully understand. Redditor 10. Herbert Sherma, my mother's sister's husband back in the late 70s, wasn't the kind of man to tell tall tales. A highway patrolman with a reputation for being grounded, dependable, and a no-nonsense professional, he lived a life steeped in routine and pragmatism. That's why, when he shared his experience, it left a lasting impression on everyone who heard it. The marriage didn't last, but the story stuck around, a haunting tale that none of us could shake off. It happened on a quiet night, just past 2 a.m., while Herbert was on patrol. The long stretches of highway were eerily still, with nothing but the hum of his patrol car and the occasional crackle of the radio to keep him company. As he drove through the endless dark, he noticed something unusual, a set of lights in the distance. At first, he thought it was a vehicle, perhaps a truck or even a low-flying aircraft. But as he got closer, the lights didn't behave like anything he'd seen before. They moved erratically, darting back and forth across the sky, pulsating in colors that seemed too vivid for any earthly source. Herbert pulled over to the side of the road, curiosity and duty compelling him to investigate further. The air felt charged, almost electric, and there was an odd hum, low and resonant, that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Stepping out of the car, he kept his eyes on the lights, now hovering directly overhead. They weren't just lights, they were part of something larger. A massive, silent craft that loomed above him. He tried to reach for his radio, but his hand froze mid-motion. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as if an invisible force had taken control of his body. The next thing Herbert remembered was waking up in his patrol car. The engine was off and the clock on the dashboard read 5:10 a.m. Nearly 3 hours had passed, yet he had no memory of what had happened during that time. The lights were gone and the highway was as silent as ever. He felt disoriented, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. His uniform was damp with sweat, and his hands trembled as he turned the key in the ignition. The patrol car roared to life, but nothing felt normal anymore. For days, Herbert tried to rationalize what had happened. He told himself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe fatigue playing tricks on his mind. But the gaps in his memory gnawed at him, and the strange sensations, an odd tingling in his limbs, a persistent headache, refused to fade. Finally, he decided to seek help, not from his fellow officers or friends, but from a hypnotherapist who specialized in regression therapy. It was a desperate move, but Herbert needed answers. Under hypnosis, fragments of the missing hours began to surface. He described being taken aboard the craft, his body weightless as he was floated through a tunnel of light. The interior of the craft was sterile, almost clinical, with walls that seemed to pulse faintly as if alive. He recalled figures surrounding him, humanoid but distinctly alien. With large black eyes and elongated limbs, they communicated with him, not through words, but through images and emotions projected directly into his mind. They weren't hostile, but their presence was overwhelming, their intentions inscrutable. Herbert described undergoing a series of procedures. The beings examined him with tools and devices that seemed to materialize from the walls themselves. He felt no pain, but the sensation of being completely exposed, both physically and mentally, was deeply unsettling. They probed not just his body but his thoughts, sifting through his memories as if flipping through the pages of a book. At one point, they showed him visions of Earth from above, vast oceans, sprawling cities, and forests teeming with life. The images were beautiful, yet they carried an undercurrent of sadness, as if to suggest that all of it was fragile, fleeting. When the session ended, Herbert was shaken but also relieved to have some clarity, however fragmented it might have been. He shared his experience with a small circle of trusted colleagues, but word eventually spread. His story caught the attention of UFO researchers, and soon Herbert found himself in the spotlight, his name appearing in books and documentaries about alien encounters. He even recorded an interview for a television special, though he later regretted the attention it brought. People were quick to label him a crackpot, a lunatic, or worse. Herbert's marriage didn't survive the strain. His wife, my aunt, couldn't reconcile the man she married with the man who now spoke of alien abductions and extraterrestrial beings. They divorced a few years later, and Herbert faded from the public eye. But his story never left him. Even after he retired from the force, he maintained that what happened to him that night was real. He insisted he wasn't seeking fame or fortune, he just wanted people to know the truth. Decades later, his story still lingers in the back of my mind. I've watched the grainy YouTube video of his interview, listened to the conviction in his voice as he recounted the events of that night. I don't know what to make of it. Part of me wants to believe him, to accept that we're not alone in the universe. But another part of me wonders if Herbert was just a man caught in the grip of something he couldn't explain, his mind filling in the blanks with the only narrative that made sense at the time. Whatever the truth may be, Herbert's experience is a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, some of which may never be fully understood. And maybe that's okay. Sometimes the questions are more important than the answers. Redditor 11. It was the kind of story you don't expect to hear from someone like Mr. Davis, my high school chemistry professor. A man of science, he was as grounded as they came. Always ready with a sharp-witted remark, a strict adherence to lab protocols, and an infectious enthusiasm for stoichiometry. He also happened to coach the soccer team, where he was known for his no-nonsense approach. This was not a man prone to exaggeration or fantasy, which is why his story hit differently. It wasn't something he shared often, but when he did, it left an impression. The event happened when he was in college, during a warm summer night in Rhode Island. Mr. Davis, his girlfriend at the time, his best friend, and the friend's dog had decided to take a walk along the beach. It was one of those perfect evenings, cool, with a light breeze carrying the salty tang of the ocean. The group split up as they strolled. Mr. Davis and his girlfriend sat on a log, soaking in the gentle crash of waves under the starlit sky. His friend and the dog wandered into the dunes, their voices and laughter growing distant. Then, the light appeared. At first, Mr. Davis thought it was a plane, a bright light in the sky, faint but growing steadily larger. He pointed it out to his girlfriend, who squinted at it and shrugged, thinking it might be a low-flying helicopter. But the light didn't move like anything they'd ever seen. It grew larger, brighter, and faster, closing the distance in a way that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Within a minute, the light revealed its source. Hovering over the ocean just beyond the shoreline was an enormous ship. Not a boat, not an aircraft. This was something entirely different. It was a giant oval-shaped craft, perfectly silent, its surface smooth and metallic. Around its midsection was a ring of pulsing lights cycling through colors that seemed otherworldly. At its bottom, a brilliant light shone down, illuminating the water below like a spotlight. Mr. Davis described the sensation as surreal, as if the world had paused to focus entirely on this moment. The waves seemed muted, the air thick and still. He and his girlfriend sat frozen, staring at the ship as it hovered above the water. For 30 seconds it remained there, a presence so foreign and yet so undeniably real that it defied comprehension. Then, without a sound, the craft shot upward. It didn't simply ascend, it vanished. One moment it was there, dominating the night sky. The next, it was a pinpoint of light, shrinking into the heavens before disappearing entirely. The abruptness of its departure left Mr. Davis and his girlfriend in stunned silence. Moments later, his friend emerged from the dunes with the dog, completely oblivious to what had just transpired. "You guys okay?" the friend asked, noticing their wide-eyed expressions. Mr. Davis turned to his girlfriend, searching for confirmation that he wasn't losing his mind. Her pale face and trembling hands told him she had seen it too. When they returned to Mr. Davis's parents' house, they couldn't contain themselves. They launched into an animated recounting of the event, describing the ship, its lights, and its impossible movement. His parents were skeptical, as any rational people would be. "A spaceship over the ocean?" his father said, raising an eyebrow. "Maybe you saw a weather balloon or a trick of the light." But Mr. Davis's mother had an idea. She handed him and his girlfriend blank sheets of paper and pens. "If you both saw the same thing, draw it," she said, gesturing for them to go into separate rooms. "Let's see how similar your stories are." Mr. Davis took the challenge seriously, sketching the craft with meticulous detail. He drew its oval shape, the ring of lights around the middle, and the bright light at the bottom. When he brought his drawing back to the living room, his girlfriend was already there with her own sketch. The two were nearly identical, down to the placement of the lights and the proportions of the ship. His parents stared at the drawings, their doubt visibly shaken. "Well," his mother said, folding her arms, "that's something." Years later, Mr. Davis told the story to our chemistry class. He used the whiteboard to recreate the sketch he and his girlfriend had made that night. The craft was wide and oval, with a distinct ring of lights and a central beam that seemed to cut through the darkness. As he drew, he spoke with the same deliberate tone he used when explaining a complex chemical equation, his credibility making the tale all the more compelling. "I'm not saying it was aliens," he told us, stepping back from the board. "I'm just saying I don't know what it was. But it wasn't a plane, and it wasn't a helicopter, and it definitely wasn't a weather balloon. It was something else." The room was silent, every one of us hanging on his words. For a man like Mr. Davis, a rational, respected figure in our school, to claim something like this, it made you think. He wasn't trying to convince us of anything, nor did he embellish the details. He simply shared what he had seen, leaving us to draw our own conclusions. To this day, I think about his story. I think about how two people saw the same thing, described it independently, and were left with no explanation. I don't know if I believe in UFOs or alien encounters, but I do believe Mr. Davis. And maybe, just maybe, the truth really is out there.